Hello and welcome to my mini tutorial on docking in Kerbal Space Program demo. Now for those of you who are aware, the demo version of Kerbal Space Program does not actually have the docking ports, and so you can't actually pull off a correct docking that you would normally do for all the purposes that you might normally do it. So for the sake of demonstration, I'm just doing a pretty much orbit matching and velocity matching, and so I wouldn't actually be able to do a complete dock in this, but I can at least give you information for how you would actually do that. And so you would actually, if you watch this video, you should have everything you need in terms of information to know how to do that in case you decide to purchase the full version of the game. So I've designed a small craft here which I think should get me into orbit with a fairly minimalistic design. It won't do much more than that, I don't think, but it should actually let me get into orbit, and from there I'm going to try and meet up with a piece of debris from a previous mission that I've launched before that's floating around in a stable orbit. And I have two command pods and I have them connected with struts just as an added level of safety to make sure that if the parachute fires and puts the craft through excessive stress, then the struts should hold the two command pods together, and so the pilot in the bottom won't actually fall to his death. Now, if you were doing a actual docking for some sort of reason, most likely you'd want to have two command pods on because you'd probably be doing some sort of crew transfer, such as if you're trying to rescue the pilot of a craft who has run out of fuel and has got himself stranded somewhere. Or maybe you just want to bring up fuel to a station, or maybe you don't even want to do any sort of transfer of crew. Maybe you're just wanting to connect to fuel up while you're en route to another step on your journey to another planet or something like that. But in any case, let's begin. So one thing that you would normally do when you're wanting to plan what you're going to do for your docking, typically you'd want to go and check out the orbit map and see how things look before you actually launch, because until you launch you could actually wait if you wanted to. You could wait until the thing that you want to actually dock with is close by, so that by the time you actually complete leaving the orbit and you're starting to circularize your orbit, you would actually be fairly close to approaching the piece of debris that you want to match up with. I'm not going to actually go to any sort of effort to try and do that, although I don't think it's going to be too bad. It's not going to be too difficult for me to actually have this piece of debris meet up with me. Now, since this one is approaching from behind, most likely what I'm going to want to do is I'm probably going to want to establish myself into a wider orbit than it, and then have it catch up to me. Otherwise, I'd have to establish myself into a narrower orbit than it and catch up to it. But since it has a wider orbit and it's going to be approaching me from behind, I think, my two options are I can wait until it actually passes me before launching, or I can quickly get myself into the orbit I want to get myself into to more or less match the orbit of the thing that I want to intercept, and then actually go a bit wider so that it actually would slowly catch up to me. But that can actually be not only a bit tedious, but it can actually also be kind of inefficient, or especially time inefficient. Not necessarily resource inefficient, but definitely time inefficient, because you'd have to go a significant amount wider than its orbit, which actually would be somewhat resource inefficient, but not that much. But the main problem would be that you would actually have to either go sufficiently far past it that it's actually going to take not many orbits to go by, or you'd have to not waste too much fuel, and you'd have to be in a situation where you have to do many orbits around before it can actually catch up to you. Neither of those is particularly desirable, so I'm hoping that that's not what happens, but we'll see. The other thing you could do is you could actually just stick around in a very low orbit for a very long time, and you could actually do a complete circle around and actually catch up to it from behind after again. That's your other option. It depends on the situation in terms of which one is more efficient for time or fuel, but I think in most cases usually what you want to do is establish yourself into a very narrow, a very shallow orbit, and normally you just want to wait until you're in position where you're approaching the object that you want to approach pretty closely on one side of the orbit, and then you just extend your orbit out to match on the other side of it. That's not always an option though, especially if you're in a time-sensitive situation, such as if the craft that you're trying to go out and rescue may perhaps not actually be in a stable orbit. You might have to act quickly, and in that case, most likely you're going to have to burn a lot of fuel. You're going to normally be involved in some sort of time or fuel trade-off, and so if time is very sensitive, then you're most likely going to have to do a trade-off in terms of fuel efficiency. So right now I'm going to start my gravity turn. I'm approaching about 10,000 meters, which is normally where I start doing that. Normally for efficiency, I normally just sort of gradually turn. I don't do my turning all at once. I make sure that my indicator is leading slightly ahead of the indicator here that shows where my actual current direction vector is, and then normally I lock in around the 90. That indicates that I'm on the 90 line, but I'm at 45 in terms of horizontal angle from the surface. And the reason for that is that in not very long I'm going to be firing the next stage of my craft, and I'm going to be running on a much smaller engine at that point, and that small engine is not going to have anywhere near as much thrust, and so even though I'll be pointing at 45, I might not necessarily be flying at a 45-degree angle. I might end up going significantly less shallower than that because it might not have enough thrust to actually send me in the direction that I have pointed my nose in, which technically speaking would actually be a bit inefficient in terms of aerodynamics, but since we're extremely high up in the atmosphere already, that doesn't really turn out to be very much of a factor. In fact, the higher you get in your orbit and the higher your velocity is before your stage ends, you don't actually necessarily need to have a thrust-to-weight ratio of greater than 1. So you might not actually need to have enough thrust that would be able to cause you to go upward at full thrust to increase your altitude. Since you're already going in somewhat of a upward direction, you'd only need to be adding a little bit of velocity in some cases. So sometimes what people will do is their upper stages of their craft might not actually give them the full 1.0 thrust-to-weight ratio or higher. Sometimes it'll actually be significantly less than that. But I think for the purpose of this launch, I think the one that I've selected here, and the setup that I've arranged it in, is such that I actually do get more than a 1 thrust-to-weight ratio. Not that it really matters, I suppose. So it looks like I'm actually going to be in a situation where this debris here is pretty well lined up with me. You do need to know that you need to lead when you're launching, because for the first 6 or 7 minutes of your launch, you're actually not going to be anywhere near your velocity of the orbit, and so this piece of debris here is actually going at a fair clip, and I'm starting off not going very fast, so it seems that it's closed the gap during the time it took between us launching and us actually getting up to a fairly respectable altitude. So it looks like my apoapsis is just about 70,000 right now, and in fact, since I'm behind the apoapsis, I actually could aim myself to be slightly lower than horizontal, and I'm still actually on track to increase my altitude. So once I get my altitude a little bit higher, if I wanted to, I could actually go even more below horizon, but I don't think I'm going to be doing that too much. I think I would rather have a bit more of a margin of safety. So although I did slightly decrease my direction I'm pointing in to be slightly below the horizon, I'm still racking up altitude, and I'm probably going to keep that up because I think that this piece of debris, apoapsis, is actually significantly above. It's actually higher than where I'm going right now, so I don't think that I particularly need to be too worried about not having my orbit go too high. I try to normally stay under 75,000 or so, and as long as I do somewhat that, it's not that inefficient as far as I'm concerned. So my periapsis is swinging up rapidly. At this point, technically, you'd actually want to point downward a bit, a little more. And I'm actually going to turn off my engines, even though I'm not quite at the full altitude of my orbit that I want. I'm actually reaching the point where my orbit is starting to extend beyond the orbit of the piece of debris that I want to target, and so I probably don't want to do that, otherwise it's going to start escaping on me. I do want to have it escape on me a little bit, because that means that it will go a little bit ahead of me, And so I can actually maintain my orbit being a little shallower than its orbit for a little while if I want. And so that will give me the effect of it will take it'll take off in front of me a little bit, and then it'll start coming back behind me. And I don't want it to get too far behind me, because when I start to equalize orbits with it, the closer my orbit is to matching its, the more orbits it will take around the planet in order for me to be able to actually close whatever gap remains between my craft and the target. So it is actually desirable to have the thing approach, to actually have your craft be approaching it from behind when your orbit is shallower than its orbit. And if your orbit is wider than the target's orbit, you actually would want to have the reverse be true. So you would actually want it to be approaching you from behind. So you'd want it to be behind you before you started that. Depends what your situation is. You might actually be in a situation where you're leaving the moon and heading back to the planet here, and so your orbit starts initially very wide, and so you might end up wanting to be in a much wider orbit than your target, but I don't see that as particularly likely of a scenario. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add maneuver here, or no, I'm not going to add maneuver. I'm going to set target. The reason I'm doing that is I want to see my ascending and descending node, because I want to figure out roughly where I want to be when I'm going to start correcting to make my orbit match a little more closely, so I'm not at such an offset from it. I'm only at about 1.6 degrees, but that is fairly significant considering that I just launched. So I should normally not be at too much of an offset, but I think the problem is that this piece of debris is at a different offset. It must have actually been launched at an offset on the other side, and I offset a little bit below on this side. When it launched, it was in a bit of an upward. It was a bit on that side of the 90 line, and I'm a bit below the 90 line, I believe. So that would be the reason for the 1.6 degree separation. Normally my separation would not be that bad. Actually, you know what I might want to do? I might want to actually be targeting the other piece of debris. I might not want... It looks like actually I targeted the wrong piece here. That's strange. I suppose that must be some sort of bug in the demo version. If the thing that you're trying to target, or untarget in this case, is too close to your trajectory, often it will select the wrong thing, something other than you're expecting. See here, I click and it says full moon debris, and then this says test mark 1 debris, so that's actually quite wrong. I think the problem is that the orbits of the two craft are very similar at this point, perhaps, and so it's selecting the orbit of the other piece of debris and giving me that instead. Yeah, that looks like that's what's happening. There we go. I just had to zoom in. Alright, so this is actually interesting. It looks like I'm actually going to be at a pretty close approach to this object here. I think what I'm going to do though is I'm going to intentionally not start correcting my orbit yet. I think I want to make it more difficult for myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it get quite away on me. I'm going to wait until the ascending node before I do any sort of corrective burn. That way it should be quite far behind me at that point, and I will actually have to do several orbits in order to close the gap. That should serve as a better demonstration for how to do docking. So I'm going to plan a maneuver here. I'm going to try and figure out, by right-clicking, I'm going to try and drag to try and get the two sides of the target's orbit so that they sort of disappear into each other, and that will let me see how I can correct my orbit to sort of approach its. So as I've said before, I believe, in another video, when you see the ascending and descending nodes start to wildly swing around, even though you're barely changing what the orbit is that you're on, that's usually a good indication that you are quite close to what you want to do in terms of matching orbits. And the more precise way to look at things. You don't even actually have to line everything up. You don't even actually really need to know what you're doing. You can just check and get to the point where the descending and ascending nodes are at a roughly 90-degree angle from where they started when you started dragging to plan your maneuver node. Oh, that actually can be quite difficult sometimes. The less of an offset there is, the more fast it will change when you slightly increase or decrease whatever your delta V is for the maneuver that you're trying to perform. So it actually becomes quite difficult sometimes to actually do what you want it to do. There we go. That's not quite perfect, but it's pretty darn good. So 59 meters a second delta V is what it's going to take. As you can see here, the target meters a second indicator shows that I have an offset of 148 or so meters a second between my target and my own craft. That will actually wildly fluctuate. If you were on the opposite side of the planet, for example, because of the fact that these are directional vectors, it would actually be indicating that you're going one way and it's going the other, and so the difference is pretty much the sum of your velocities. So it actually can be a ridiculously high number, and so this velocity indicator, when you're actually in the mode where it shows your target, actually can be quite meaningless when you're far away from matching your orbits with your target. So I'm just going to go ahead and get into position for my next burn that I'm going to be doing. It's only going to take me about 4 seconds. You'll notice that when you are already in a stable orbit, it really does not take you that long to adjust your orbit. Now, another thing I'm going to want to make sure to do here is shortly after I do the ascending node adjustment, I'm going to want to do a small burn to actually stabilize my orbit, because it doesn't look like it's fully circularized yet here on this other side. That shouldn't be too hard though, because I'm only doing a 4-second burn here. I should be able to quickly get to where I need to be to circularize my orbit after I've done this adjustment. Okay. There we go. That's pretty close. Now I'm going to want to plan another maneuver at the apoapsis here in the prograde direction, just so that I get 70,000 or so. That doesn't look like very much delta V at all. That's only 6.5 meters a second. Not bad. I really wasn't kidding when I said that it doesn't take you very much delta V to drastically change your orbit as you already get into a stable orbit. Since you're already going over 2,000 meters a second, it really does not take you very long to go from 2,000 to 2,200 or something like that. And of course, since my apoapsis here is 170,000, I'm not really going to be needing to go to the normal orbit. If you're at about 70,000 meters, then you really need to be going about almost 2,300 meters a second. But since I'm actually at a really wide orbit on this side, it's not that extreme. There we go. I have a bit of a margin of safety, it looks like. So that's 71,000, 71,000 just barely apoapsis. That's good. All right. So as I said before, I was not going to really do a big orbit adjustment, and I was going to wait until my target got far more offset from me than it currently is. And that looks like that's what's happening. So each time that I go around, the orbit's probably going to get bigger. The intersect distance is going to be bigger until finally it will start decreasing again. Normally what you're going to want to do to finally orbit match when you get pretty reasonably close to the target, you normally want to orbit match by doing a prograde burn on whatever side you're already closest on. So, or in other words, the opposite side from where your distance between your orbits is the biggest. Then you can worry about decreasing your orbit when it extends beyond on another side. You can always worry about that later. But really what you want to do is you either want to have your orbit be narrower than its orbit or wider, and you need to establish that based on whether you're approaching it from the rear or it's approaching you from the rear. Since I'm going to be approaching it from the rear, I'm going to need to make sure that I maintain a smaller orbit, because I'm going all the way around and I'm going to be approaching it from the rear after I get all the way back. So I'm going to want to stay in this narrow orbit for quite some time. So I'm going to start accelerating, because I might as well at this point. Now, one slightly useful thing for having one side of my orbit be well in excess of 120,000 meters is that I get an additional time acceleration level unlocked at about 120,000, and so this doesn't take quite as long as it would otherwise take. Once I get beyond 120,000, I have an additional level unlocked. There we go. So as you can see, the distance is actually vastly increased here, but that's about as bad as it gets. After that, it starts to decrease. As I've fallen below 120,000 altitude, it has decreased my maximum time acceleration level once again. Another thing that you'll probably notice here is that I'm actually very short on liquid fuel at this point. That's actually fine, because if all else fails, I do have my monopropellant, and you'd be surprised how far not only you can make liquid fuel go when you're already in a stable orbit, but how far you can make monopropellant go as well, especially when you don't have a very heavy craft that you're pushing. This looks like about the worst that it possibly gets at the moment. My target is on the exact opposite side of the planet at this intersect. However, at the second intersect, it looks like the difference is actually slightly decreasing, and so that means we're going to start getting closer, obviously, which is a good sign. So I'm guessing I'm probably going to need another 5 orbits before I can actually approach in the way I want to. Once I get reasonably close, then at that point I can start extending my orbit so that there's not such an extreme difference between the 2 orbits. And that will mean that although I will have to make more orbits in order to correct a difference, it'll also mean that if the change is more than a few hundred kilometers, and if the next lap around is actually going to make it so that it's ahead of me, if I decrease, yeah, see that? That's a difference of quite a drastic amount. I'm going from 1,200 kilometer difference to only 432 over here. So when I get over here, target position at 1, I'm definitely going to want to do a prograde burn when I'm around on this side to somewhat approximate the orbit of the craft, and that will actually change what my next intersect will be. It'll be dynamically changing as I do that burn, and you could actually custom tailor that burn so as to minimize your offset, but you're going to want to know that if you end up locking in at a place where your orbit still doesn't match yet, that you're going to still be catching up on it a little bit, or perhaps be having it pass you a little bit. So you'll want to factor that in when you do whatever your adjustment's going to be. Okay, so now we're getting to the point where it's not actually decreasing the distance anymore. It's actually having quite the opposite effect. It's actually starting to increase. See, the target is actually going to be target position at 1. Actually, no, it looks like that it's still going to be ahead of me for one more lap around. So that's good. So oh, this is interesting. Here it looks like it's going to be, oh right, I think because I'm ahead of it. So here it's actually going to be behind me. Target position and my position. It's going to be behind me here, and it's going to be ahead of me here. That's strange. Oh, it's because of the fact that this is number 1 and this is number 2, which means that it's going to be slightly ahead of me here, and then it's going to go all the way around, and I'm probably going to pass it somewhere halfway through, and then it's going to be behind me by here. So really this is actually where I'm going to want to do it. When you have something like that happen where it starts to confuse you, when you are behind it on one part of your intersect and you are ahead of it on your other, that's telling you that you're going to want to start orbit matching, because if you let that happen, you're going to pass it. So what I can do is I can slowly increase my orbit here by slowly burning prograde, and I can sort of examine the effect that it will have. And I want to try and see a combination of getting my orbits as closely matched as I can and also getting a good intercept. So on this side, it looks like it's going to be breaking away from me, and it's going to be at quite a distance here. At this side, I'm actually quite close to an intercept. However, my orbit's not going to be quite matching its orbit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and make this orbit, this intercept, close the gap. Oh, it looks like if I do that, it's actually going to be increasing. It's going to go quite a ways away. So that's 423. This is only 401. So what I might actually want to do is do two separate orbital burns, actually. So around here, it's going to be 413 separation, and this is going to be 156. So I think, yeah, I think I'll burn around here, and I'll burn about that level where I am right now. Actually, if you wanted to, you could try and make it so that if you figure out where the point between the two sets of intercepts are, if you could try and make it so that where you are burning, that you're burning at such an amount that it looks like both of these are on a rather equal distance between you, and not only are they rather equal, but the size of the difference is actually rather equal, and that will make it so that it normally means that you could burn here again and get your correction in place, but it looks like we're not going to get that lucky. It's not going to work out that well. So what we're just going to worry about doing at this point is just doing the majority of our burn here. We can always fine-tune it later. There we go. Another thing that you're going to want to notice most likely is that when you are burning and you have a maneuver node out there, these intercepts don't seem to change. But if you clean off all your nodes that you have that you've placed on the orbital map, whenever you burn even the slightest amount, you'll actually start seeing the indicators changing in real time. So this is where I have the one intercept. That's 259 kilometers on this side and 403 on that side. So I want to be burning around here somewhere perhaps next time. But since actually I'm most likely going to want to burn on this side to correct this side's orbit to make these two match perhaps, I might get some sort of advantage from doing that. So I think I'll burn on this side and correct this discrepancy between these two orbits a little bit here. I'm actually getting at the point where once I start getting much more precise than this, the main difference between my orbit and its orbit is going to be just the distance here in between the two orbits. That will be the majority. Once you start getting to that point, you really want to start thinking about really carefully planning your moves ahead, far well ahead of where you're actually going to be doing them. But I'm going to zoom around to the other side here. Actually, before I do that, I should probably lay a maneuver node to give me an idea of where I want to plan my next burn. When I get to about there, I'll do another prograde burn, and I'll be examining what happens, how it adjusts the maneuver nodes. And as I detect how they interact with my burn, then I can decide how I want to actually do my burn. Now you need to be careful sometimes because these indicators here on the map, it might be your target indicator, and so you wouldn't want to burn there thinking you're going prograde, so you most likely would want to actually pay attention to what mode your navball is on, and it looks like it says orbit mode here, so that's good. So I'm going to go to the other side so I think I can get a better view of what's going on in terms of where the two orbits are not matching, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a burn here. Oh, before I do that, I think I'm going to need to equalize a bit more because I've already swung around the planet a bit more already. Okay, so it looks like this orbit is going to swing back this way, and this orbit is going to swing forward that way. So it looks like they're going to match up around here somewhere. But actually, this is interesting. I actually think I need to be burning in the opposite direction. I need to burn retrograde because my orbit looks like it extends beyond. So I think I will do that because that's actually what I think I had planned. I think I was just doing it wrong just now. So yeah, the whole intent of this burn is to get it so that this distance here is decreased, and it looks like this is the effect I actually want right now, where both sets of intercepts are sort of merging on each other. And it looks like, oh, this is interesting, I only have one set of intersects now, or actually I do have two, but they're extremely close. They're extremely close to each other. They're almost on top of each other, in fact. So I'm still in a slightly more shallow orbit than the debris is. So that means I will still continue to approach it. So if the target is here and I'm here, that means I will, over the course of the next few orbits, I'll slowly start to match up with it. So I'm not actually on the wrong side. If my orbit was wider and its position was going to be that it was past me, then it would keep burning past me, and so that would be not good. My ascending and descending nodes are still 0.0, so that's good. They don't need to be exact, even if they're less than 0.5, you're still usually fine. But it does depend on where the next intercept that you have is. If the next intercept that you have is actually going to be at the point where you're at the most offset in terms of the angle of your orbit, then most likely, unless you're actually near an ascending or descending node, it's going to be too late to correct it. And that will cause you a bit of a problem. So now it looks like I'm actually just about out of fuel. So I'm going to have to do the rest of any burns that I'm going to want to do with RCS fuel. However, that should be fine. I'm going to want to do a few orbits around to see what my effect is. When I get there, it should tell me what the distance of my next orbit will be. Right now it's 237 kilometers. I assume that will drop by about 40 or so, and so I'll have to do another 5 orbits maybe. Oh, this is interesting. It looks like my orbit actually has slightly come under periapsis. So I'm not going to be able to do much about that right now, because if I burn upward or away from the planet, that's going to be extremely inefficient of a burn. So I think what I'll want to do is just deal with it and get through the atmosphere. Since I'm only going a few thousand in the atmosphere, it really doesn't matter that much. It will, however, have the effect of trimming my apoapsis, which is a bit undesirable, although it will mean that I'm going to have a higher speed coming out the other end of this. So that means any planning that I have done will be slightly altered by that. So that is a good thing to keep in mind. However, it's going to be so slight that it's really not going to matter in the grand scheme of things, because I'm only going about 2,000 meters under, and it looks like I've already cleared it. Alright, so it's at 237. See, it's decreased my separation now, and the next one's going to be 49, so that's interesting. So that means I'm not going to want to do another complete orbit. I'm going to want to, at this point, I'm going to want to start adjusting my orbit, because that's the point where things are going to start getting interesting. That's where you're decreasing by a very small amount, and the amount is actually smaller than the difference between your orbits at the wide side. So that's where I'm going to want to start fixing things. Okay, so as I get close to the apoapsis, I'm going to want to do a bit of a corrective burn in the prograde direction to shore up my periapsis a little bit. That's probably going to use the rest of my fuel. Oh, not even. I have a little bit left. Isn't that interesting? So now this is interesting as well. I have a 25 kilometer orbit and a 44 now, so that's actually better than what I was planning before. So actually what I probably could do at that point is, when I get pretty close to the intercept, perhaps what I might want to do at that point is start thinking about burning to match orbits on the far side. I don't want to match completely because I still want to have a little bit of distance where I'm a little bit shallower than its orbit, and so I'll still be catching up on a little bit, but I really am not going to want that distance to be very big because, as we saw before, I went from 237 to about 50. So if the orbit distance was drastically less than it is now, then I might be able to, in one more orbit, have the whole thing corrected. So I'll think about that. I think when I get to the other side, I'm going to want to figure out exactly where I want my burn to be done, most likely on the opposite of here. So over there somewhere. It doesn't have to be exactly precise because I will see the effect as I get closer to there, and I'll be able to make it much more accurate as I go. Oh, this is interesting. It looks like these numbers have changed all of a sudden. And I actually have got to the point now where it's, oh, since I passed it, it says the next orbit around, it's going to be behind me, which means I'm going to overshoot it. And I don't think I want that. Looks like, in fact, I've already overshot it a bit. That is actually not good. I think the indicators lied to me a little bit, in fact. So I'm probably going to have to widen out my orbit a little prematurely. It's going to make things a little bit not exactly desirable, but it looks like it's got to be done because I've already surpassed my target, which is not good. And it looks like I've also surpassed it by quite a distance. It's already 45 right now. Is this 44? Oh, this is interesting. For some reason, it looks like the distance is slowly decreasing between us. So it must be at a higher velocity than me right now. 2471, 2490. Oh yeah, it's just barely at a higher velocity than me. Okay. So I'm going to want to definitely start burning hard. Oh, look at this. This changed yet again on me. That's interesting. It must have just been because I was on time warp and now I'm not. And so everything is kind of messing me around. Okay, so that's fine. It may have also been because of my maneuver node. The placement of my maneuver node might have somewhat bugged out the game a little bit. Even though I didn't put any velocity behind it, I think that it did kind of change things. So I'm going to want to put a maneuver node there, and I'm going to want to circularize. As I circularize and match with its orbit, you can see the maneuver nodes change around like crazy. And how close do they get? 13. That's interesting. Actually, at this point, since your orbit is extremely close with its orbit, you don't actually want to worry about getting your orbit exactly matching. What you're really more concerned about is getting an intercept that is at the minimum distance. When your intercept distance is this small, really what you're going to be focused on is optimization at this point. So what I would want to do probably is look over here and get a better view of what's going on, and then do very gradual adjustments. So here I can get it to about 5.8. That seems to be about the best I can get it, just because of the fact that my orbit doesn't quite match up. If I go any further, it's now 8.4, it's going further away. 2.9, maybe I'll try a little bit further back. 2.3. Oh, 1.8. 2.0. Okay, so it's increasing on that side. So I'm going to want to go the other way. Whoa. These are very touchy controls. You're much better off often to grab very lightly and drag very small amount. Another thing you might notice is that sometimes when you end up with your intercept being near the ascending node, sometimes that can actually be quite handy, because that might allow you to do two adjustments at once that might make your orbit be a little more accurate. But since it's 0.0, it really doesn't seem to matter. So I think 2.4 is pretty good, but I think I was able to get 1.8 before. I think it was a little bit further back. 3.0, okay, that's wrong. 1.8, okay, there we go. So I'm going to want to most likely get in the position, get ready to lock in. There we go, locked in. So now I'm ready, I'm facing the right way. You may have noticed that I'm not really doing any of this in the staging view. You can if you want, but typically it makes things a lot harder because normally whenever you're doing a burn where the distance of your apoapsis and periapsis matter, or when you're trying to orbit match, it's much more desirable to be in the orbit view because otherwise you can't see what's going on. I mean, technically once you've set your maneuver node, and if you're confident that that maneuver node is exactly what you want, then you can actually go back in staging mode if you'd like for your burn. But sometimes you'll actually place things wrong, and so it can actually be a bit beneficial to not trust that you've done it right and therefore stay in orbit mode so that you can actually see as you make your adjustment exactly what the effect is. Because sometimes you will be wrong and you will want to do something about it, and the sooner you can catch your problem, the sooner you can fix it. So I'm not going to have the full time actually. I'm going to run out of fuel. There we go. So I'm going to want to turn my RCS on, and I'm pressing H, and I'm actually burning RCS now because I have run out of fuel. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to kill this maneuver node, and I'm actually going to start seeing in real time these intercepts are going to start changing. And so that's another thing, is you can actually switch to RCS to do some of your adjustments if you want. Oh, look at this. This is interesting. Yeah, the RCS will give you more fine-grained control. Also, you don't have to turn your whole craft around in order to reverse. You can just, rather than pressing H, you can press N, or vice versa. So it looks like 2.5 is about the narrowest I can get. Yeah, you will often see that there's some adjustments that start happening. Things will lie to you a little bit if you don't get your maneuver node exact, like if you don't actually do your delta V adjustment exactly the way you'd planned. When you start getting drastically less than 50 kilometer separation, things will adjust in quite a hurry. So actually 2.5 is good though, because I think that's actually the part of the range where you start to get to the point where you can actually see the other craft. And as you can see now, my orbit is actually wider than its, so it's going to slowly start increasing on me as I swing towards either side. Oh, it says I'm throttled up, and that's because I was burning. I'm going to just press S to get rid of that burn. I'm going to turn off my RCS, and I'm going to swing around with time warp on. And then when I get close to this intercept, I'm not going to want to do an adjustment until I get close, most likely. Because if you make an adjustment sooner on, what's going to happen is you're going to drastically throw off this distance of intercept here. Most likely what you're going to want to do is get to the closest intercept you can, then make your adjustment, which will make your other side better in terms of better lineup with the other side of the orbit. When you do that, you can actually, just before you do that, what you might actually want to do is you'll probably want to burn slightly in the direction of the craft, because if you can quickly catch up to it those last 2 kilometers or so, then you can worry about orbit matching after that. Once you're really close, it's actually much easier because you will have just about figured out everything you want to do at that point. Okay, so I'm slowing down taking off my time warp here. Now what I'm actually going to do is I took off the SAS there, and now I'm looking, and this directional indicator shows me that means my craft is pointed toward the target. This is my retrograde. That's retrograde in terms of the. Oh, actually, wait a minute. I need to make sure this is in the right mode. Target. There we go. So this is showing my velocity vector with respect to the target, and I want that velocity vector to be in the actually pointing lined up with here, because that means I will be hurtling toward my target. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to burn on the other side of it a little bit. Since I'm using RCS, I'm not really burning per se, but there we go. So now I've pretty closely lined up with it. Another thing is, when you're doing really precise movements, you might actually want to turn RCS off, then turn it on to do your burn, because SAS actually are using your just your inertia in your craft. The command module has a bit of a ability to maneuver just on its own. You'll probably want to use that because when you use the thrusters, the RCS thrusters to maneuver, often the maneuvers themselves will throw you at a different trajectory because of the fact that you're dealing with very small velocities, like 4.4 meters a second is the actual difference going on here. It starts to affect you greatly. There we go. So I've turned off RCS, and there we go. Lock in. And now what you're going to see is that the intercept actually has driven off into the distance here. Now it says 2.2 kilometers, and it says it's not going to be for quite a while. So what you can actually do at this point is you can actually, now that your vector is pointing very closely to where you want it to be going, you can actually lock in, you can put your RCS on, and you can actually burn more in that direction. And that will increase your velocity, and that will have the effect that you're going to hurtle towards it faster now, and so you're actually going to get a much closer separation to it than if you had not done that. Now that also means that you're going to, every single bit of meter a second offset that you get from your target means you're going to have to cancel that burn. You're going to have to burn in the opposite direction to counteract that. But since we're still talking about very small amounts here, it really doesn't matter. So this is going to take me less than a kilometer away. So that's a massive improvement from 2.5 kilometers. However, it is going to take us all the way till we get about there before we're going to actually get much closer. So there we go. We're approaching. There we go. So we're now at the near the narrowest part here. So you'll see that my direction vector is actually, it's changed. I'm actually no longer pointed anywhere near the craft. So I'm going to want to once again, in fact, even what you can do is you can actually burn at retrograde, and that will give you more of an efficient effect when you do this. See this over here? Actually, I think with that, never mind, that doesn't always give you a more efficient effect. That gives you an efficient effect for if what you're wanting to do is completely eradicate your offset, the velocity between you and it. But if you're wanting to change your direction vector so that you're actually hurtling towards your target, I guess you're not really going to want to do that. And you can see, as you can see here, see I've got a very small velocity here, 0.3 meters a second. That actually means that as I curve around the planet, since our orbits are different, it's going to start actually adjusting, it's going to start changing very rapidly. So what you can actually do is you can sort of predict the angle that it's going to go in, and you can lock in, and then you can start burning in that direction, and you can actually orbit match entirely just by doing this. So you won't even have to think about orbit matching, you'll just be doing it as a result of doing all of your adjustments that you're wanting to do. Okay. I'm going to burn a whole bunch. There we go. 0.2. Look at that. 0.1. Okay. 0.1 is probably good because if we are in time warp when we approach the craft, we can actually collide with it, and when you collide with a craft when you're in time warp, you're going to have a serious problem because often what will happen is those distances will be slightly imprecise, and if you're in time warp when you collide, it will give you the effect of colliding at a much higher rate, actually. So often you don't want to get things too precise. So I'm going to actually start doing my maneuvers in this view so you can actually see the effect of what's going on here. You'll actually see that the changes are much more severe here now. Now we're getting really, really close to the craft, so what we're actually going to see, we're going to see this swing around. Oh, it looks like we just collided with it. However, it was at sufficiently slow velocity that it didn't actually hurt us very much. So I'm actually going to want to counteract my 5 or so meters a second offset that I have with it because it's actually racing away from me now. And I'm going to want to start racing towards it instead of away from it. However, as I go, I'm going to have it sort of running away from me because we have all sorts of crazy velocity vectors going on here. Oop. So I'm actually burning in reverse direction right now. I'm bringing my retrograde vector. Oh, what's going on now? That's wrong. Ha! I screwed up. Yeah, I don't want to do that. It's racing off now into the distance. Not good. Yeah, when you start getting really close, I think that's why the priority is to actually have your velocity be cancelled out rather than your priority being closing the distance. Because if your velocity is ridiculously high and you can't stop it quick, then it doesn't matter how close you get, because what's going to happen is you're just not going to be able to stop it fast enough. See, you might notice now you can actually see the direction vector change every time I do any sort of turn of any sort, because that thruster is actually throwing me off. So I'm going to lock in about there. I'm going to burn forward. Then I'm going to try and get exactly centered on where I think it's going to be. I'm going to get ready to burn in the opposite direction because it's going to hit me if I don't. There we go. Okay. Now it's slowly racing off that way. I'm going to burn here now. There we go. Oh. Okay. To see where it's going, and I have to burn in the direction that it's going. I need to get there. Whoop. Here we go. Yeah. Now I need to burn in the opposite direction of where I'm headed. There we go. There we go. Whoa. Lock in. Burn forward on retrograde. There we go. So, actually, what you can actually do is you can either burn forward on the retrograde once you get really close, or you can burn reverse on the prograde, whatever you want to do. There's many ways to do it. So now we are effectively, we are really darn close to this thing. It's slowly turning in that direction. There we go. Oh, it's going down that way now. I'm going to want to go over here. There we go. So we are extremely close to it. We're definitely at the distance where we could just walk out and touch it. We could pretty much do whatever we want to do, even though we're not docked. There is no docking in the demo, so obviously that doesn't really matter. So, I mean, I might as well go and do a spacewalk and go and touch that debris. If you know what you're doing, actually what you could probably do is you could take off, you could do a spacewalk, you could go and you press R to turn your little dude's thruster on. You could actually push that debris toward your ship if you wanted to. Hey, look, looks like that debris is going to just about hit the ship there. Oh, might have even done so. I'm going to go down here and I'm going to give it a shove that way. How about that? I'm going to collide with it. There we go. Boom! Ran into it. Haha. Another thing I could do is I could probably even stop its rotation. If I hit it enough times in the right way, I don't know if that's a good idea though. I might just be wasting my thruster pack fuel. I don't think I want to do that because then I won't be able to get back to my craft. Then, that would make a pretty good case for trying to do a rescue mission, actually. But this is the rescue mission, so I probably don't want to do that sort of thing. Boom. Haha. Stop rotating. Alright, well I'm just going to go back to the craft now. Doesn't seem like I really accomplished much by all that. You will actually probably notice, if you're familiar at all with the docking mode, which I believe I showed you before, I'm not sure. I'll show you that right now if I haven't already, just to make sure. Everything that I showed you right now actually was in staging mode. So in staging mode, things behave a little bit differently. I'm going to rotate so that I'm upright. Whoa, whoa, that's a bit too far. There we go. The way that things work in staging mode, if you use the I, J, K, L, and H and N keys for the RCS, then actually let's turn around so we're going the right way. J will send you that way, L will send you that way, I sends you that way, K sends you that way, and WASD. W sends you that way, S sends you that way, A sends you that way, D sends you that way. So it seems pretty much the same. It's actually not quite the same. IJKL seems to be translate. Yeah, see this is if you have your hands on WASD and IJKL, you can do just about any direction you want at the same time. So H is forward, N is reverse. I'm gonna go forward a little more. Okay. I'm gonna go reverse now. There we go. K is gonna send me upward a little bit more. H is gonna send me more forward. This is actually quite intuitive when you have it like this. It's much easier to control. So if you really wanted to velocity match, what you could actually do is you could match each direction until it's not matched anymore. Assuming that the other object is not spinning, it's actually probably a lot easier to do. Another thing you might end up wanting to do, you might want to actually just use the there we go, use the retrograde indicator. There we go. That's pretty close. Anyways, I didn't actually want to do that. Let's go back, let's click our resources thing here so we see that. Okay, so normally if you have RCS on and you use WASD, I'm going to turn this off. W does that, A does that, S does that, D does that. So these are rotational, but if you go into docking mode, these are no longer rotational. What will actually happen, actually you can switch. And now what will happen is W does this, that's actually forward. S does this, that's actually reverse. A makes you go that way, D makes you go that way. So these are translational controls in docking mode. You can hit space, and now you're switched back to this ROT control, which is the rotating. So I don't know what the UN stands for, but basically it's another word that probably means translate. And if you hit space, you switch. So now I can go back into translate mode, where I'm burning that way now. Now I'm going that way. Then you keep hitting space. Now that's a bit confusing because if you're in docking mode and you hit space, you're switching between modes of operation. But if you are in staging mode and you hit space, you're going to start staging, you're going to fire your stages, and so that can be potentially dangerous. But what you actually can do is in staging mode, you can just have your fingers on WASD, and then you can have your fingers on IJKL, so you get all the different things you might want that way. So anyways, we're done with our docking, I guess. So as you can see, our orbits are quite exactly matched. Not exactly, but pretty close. So really what I would want to do, all you need to do to get out of this is you just need to get near your apoapsis and burn a little bit in the retrograde direction. I'm gonna unset this as a target. It doesn't look like it wants to let me, but I can just at least switch into orbit or surface mode. I'll switch into orbit. I will spin around. I'll go to my retrograde indicator. Now since I'm using RCS, of course, as I think I said before, I can either burn prograde at the retrograde indicator, or I can burn retrograde at the prograde indicator. So now I'm holding prograde, and so see now my orbit has fallen below 70,000. So now as soon as you fall below 70,000, you're in an unstable orbit, and you will eventually land on the planet if you do no other action whatsoever. I can just keep holding this, and my orbit will keep falling. And if you get under about 30,000, then you pretty much aren't going to need to do multiple swings around the planet. Actually, if you get around under 35,000, you're not going to need to do multiple swings around. So I've got myself well under, so I'm definitely going to land now. There we go. And so now we're returning home now. So we're definitely overshooting the launch location. I think the launch location is actually down there. So we've well overshot it, but oh well, doesn't matter. So now, here we go. I'm going to go check out staging mode. We are most likely going to land in the ocean, I think. Can verify that with orbit mode, but of course that's always changing. Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty sure thing that we're going to land in the ocean. I don't know. 50-50. Oh yeah, we're definitely landing in the ocean. That's for sure. Not even close. Okay. Once we fall under about 500, that's usually when I fire the parachutes. There we go. We're getting pretty close to 500 meters a second. Since I also have this other part here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin around. Then I fired the separator. Now I'm firing the parachute. I like to spin around and not be facing the direction that it would automatically take me in before I fire the parachute, because often what will happen is sometimes when you separate any other stages that you have below you, they might actually hit you and hurt you somehow, or they might spin off at a weird angle and you know, there might be some sort of collision that happens. Or maybe what might happen sometimes is it will actually stick below you, and maybe, or it might stick on the other side and it might interfere with the way your parachutes operate. So I like to turn a little bit before I actually separate any under stages that I want to get rid of. I also take off the time compression before I get down to about 500, because I like to make sure that my parachute fully deploys. There we go, it fully deployed. Now I can time warp down pretty much until just before I hit the surface. Then I turn time warp off again, because as I think I've warned before, time warp can actually screw things up, especially when you're in the atmosphere. You can get all sorts of strange effects that you wouldn't think that you'd get. So there we go. This concludes our mission. Thanks for watching.